Just past noon on August 5th, the ground shook hard enough across southern Mindanao that nearly 6 million people felt it, some of them strongly enough to run for open ground. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology initially clocked it at magnitude 7. The U.S. Geological Survey settled on 6.3. Within hours, a magnitude 5.2 aftershock followed, and the next night, another one hit at 5.6. None of that would be especially alarming on its own, except this exact patch of ocean floor off Sarangani has now produced a major earthquake, roughly every 2 to 3 weeks since early June. And the first one in that sequence was one of the deadliest the Philippines has seen in 50 years. If you stay with me to the end, you'll understand exactly why seismologists are watching this particular stretch of seafloor so closely right now, and I'll give you the one. Number that would tell them whether this is a fading aftershock sequence or something building toward a second major rupture. If you find yourself hooked by the way the Earth actually works, subscribe right now because this is the kind of story that keeps developing, and you'll want to be here for the next update. Let's start with exactly where this is happening, because the location is half the story. The action is centered off the coast of Sarangani province at the southern tip of Mindanao, near the city of General Santos, a metro area of more than 500,000 people. This entire zone sits directly above the Cotabato Trench, the offshore boundary where the Sunda Plate is being forced underneath the Philippine microplate in a slow, grinding subduction process that has been building strain here for centuries. On June 8th of this year, that strain let go catastrophically. A magnitude 7.8 earthquake ruptured offshore at a depth of roughly 33 to 57 kilometers, depending on which agency's model you're reading. And it was immediately followed, within about 80 minutes, by a cluster of major aftershocks measuring magnitude 6.1, 6.0, and 6.5. At least 106 people died. Over 1,300 were injured. More than 121,000 homes across Mindanao were damaged or destroyed. Favos called it among the most destructive earthquakes the country has recorded in 5 decades. This shaking was so severe it caused a death and injuries on the Sangihe and Talod Islands of Indonesia, more than 300 kilometers away. That was the earthquake that put this entire region on the map for anyone watching global seismicity, and it has not stopped talking since. Now here's the first twist, and it's an important one. If you looked only at the June 8th event, you'd file it under a single tragic but self-contained disaster, a big earthquake that hit, killed people, and then the usual aftershock sequence gradually faded out the way these things typically do. That is not what happened here. On June 26th, a magnitude 6.5 struck the same general zone. On July 14th, a magnitude 6.2 hit, its epicenter sitting barely 19 kilometers from where the next major event would eventually occur. Late July brought a magnitude 5.3 near Davao and a pair of moderate quakes, 5.4 and 5.1, in the Philippine Sea. And then on August 5th, this magnitude 6.3 itself followed almost immediately by aftershocks of its own. If you judge each of these events individually, none of them looks especially unusual for one of the most seismically active subduction zones on the planet. But strung together into a single timeline, stretching 2 full months and counting, they tell a very different story, one of a fault system that ruptured catastrophically in June and has been actively renegotiating the stress on its neighboring segments ever since. So let's clear up a term you're going to hear over and over in coverage of this sequence, because it gets used loosely and it means something very specific. Aftershock sequence. It is not just a fancy way of saying more earthquakes keep happening in the same place. It describes a well-understood physical process, and once you understand it, the last 2 months on the Cotabato Trench start to make a lot more sense. When a megathrust earthquake, like the June 8th magnitude, 7.8 ruptures, it doesn't just release stress evenly across the entire fault, it redistributes it unevenly, easing pressure on the patch that actually slipped while dumping additional stress onto the surrounding rock, onto adjacent fault segments, and onto smaller structures nearby that hadn't broken yet. Those newly stressed patches then fail on their own schedule, sometimes within minutes, sometimes months later, producing exactly the kind of scattered, months-long sequence of magnitude 5s and 6s that Mindanao has been experiencing since June. Seismologists model the general decline of this activity using a relationship called Omori's law, first described in the 1890s, which predicts that aftershock frequency should drop off roughly in proportion to time since the main shock. For a rupture as large as magnitude 7.8, that decay can legitimately stretch on for months, sometimes longer, especially in a region with this much accumulated tectonic complexity. So let me ask you something before we go deeper, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. When you hear that a region has been producing major earthquakes every couple of weeks for 2 straight months, is your first instinct that the danger is winding down, or that it's still actively unfolding? drop a comment, because I think the honest answer says a lot about how most people intuitively read a long aftershock sequence. Here's the geometry worth understanding. The Cotabato Trench doesn't fail as one single uniform patch. It's segmented, made up of smaller sections of fault that can rupture somewhat independently of each other, even though they're mechanically linked. The June 8th main shock almost certainly broke one of those segments. The cluster of aftershocks in the following 80 minutes likely represented immediately adjacent patches responding to that sudden stress transfer. But the events that followed in the weeks after, the June 26th magnitude 6.5, the July 14th magnitude 6.2, and now this August 5th magnitude 6.3, sitting at a shallow depth of around 10 kilometers, according to Fivolks, are consistent with stress continuing to migrate along the trench, loading up segments that sit just outside the zone that already ruptured. That migration pattern is exactly what seismologists watch for after any major subduction earthquake, because it can mean one of two very different things. Either the surrounding segments are simply releasing their newly acquired stress in a series of moderate, manageable events, which is the reassuring outcome, or the stress transfer is pushing an adjacent, previously unruptured segment closer to its own independent failure point, which is the outcome that keeps monitoring agencies paying close attention. Now, here's what makes this more interesting than the panic headlines that tend to follow every earthquake cluster like this one. There's a well-documented, historically grounded reason to take this specific stretch of coastline seriously, and it has nothing to do with speculation. We'll get there because it's both more useful and more grounded than the doom scroll version of this story. But first, let's be honest about something that always comes up after events like these, and that's the confusion caused by different agencies reporting different numbers for the exact same earthquake. When the August 5th quake hit, Fivolks initially reported it as roughly magnitude 7, while the USGS settled on 6.3, and the European monitoring centers landed somewhere in between before revising toward the American figure. That's not a cover-up or a communication failure. It's simply what happens with any large earthquake in its first minutes. Different networks are built on different arrays of seismic stations, positioned at different distances and angles from the epicenter, and they run their own independent automated algorithms to estimate magnitude before any human analyst reviews the data. A quake centered offshore, in this case in the Sulawesi Sea south of General Santos, has fewer nearby stations feeding data than one that strikes directly under a populated inland area, which makes that first automated estimate inherently less precise. As more stations report in and the waveforms get cross-checked, the numbers converge, which is exactly what happened here over the following hours. Multiple agencies disagreeing briefly right after a large offshore quake. Is the system working as designed? Not a sign that anyone is hiding the true scale of what happened. Now here's something that reframes this whole sequence, because the Cotabato Trench and the broader Mindanao subduction system have a track record worth knowing. This isn't the first time this general stretch of coastline has produced a major, damaging earthquake. Back in August of 1976, a magnitude 7.8 struck offshore Mindanao, generating a tsunami that killed thousands of people, one of the deadliest natural disasters in Philippine history, and a sobering reminder of exactly what this subduction zone is capable of when a segment ruptures at full scale. More recently, in August of 2021, a magnitude 7.1 hit Davao Oriental, on the opposite side of Mindanao, along the separate Philippine Trench. And in July of 2022, a magnitude 7.0 struck Luzon at the northern end of the country on an entirely different fault system. None of those events are directly connected to what's happening off Sarangani right now. What they establish is a pattern that seismologists already understood well before this June. The Philippines sits at the collision point of multiple converging plate boundaries, and major, damaging earthquakes are not rare anomalies here. They are a recurring structural feature of the geography itself, which is exactly why the country maintains one of the most active earthquake monitoring networks in the world, which brings us to the claim that tends to circulate after any earthquake cluster like this. 1. The idea that a sequence like this must be building toward one final catastrophic megaquake, a single connected failure sweeping down the entire trench. The evidence doesn't support that framing, and the reasons are specific. Aftershock sequences following large subduction earthquakes are common, expected, and statistically well understood. The vast majority of them decay over weeks to months without ever producing an event larger than the original main shock. Segmented fault systems like the Cotabato Trench do not automatically unzip end to end just because one patch has ruptured and stress has migrated to a neighbor. Each segment still has to independently accumulate enough strain to fail on its own. And the fact that this sequence has so far topped out below the magnitude of the June 8th main shock is itself a meaningful, reassuring data point, not a guarantee. but a pattern consistent with ongoing stress release rather than an escalating buildup towards something larger. So here's what actually matters going forward, and this is the payoff I promised you at the start. The number to watch isn't how many earthquakes this sequence produces, because a long tail of magnitude 4s, 5s, and even occasional 6s is exactly what a normal aftershock sequence from a magnitude 7.8 looks like. The number to watch is whether any future event in this sequence exceeds the magnitude of the June 8th main shock itself, or whether the epicenters start clustering on a segment of the Cotabato Trench that hasn't yet ruptured in this sequence rather than continuing to fall within or near the zone TH magnitude 7. It keeps tracking along the already ruptured patch and its immediate surroundings. That's consistent with a standard, if unusually active, aftershock sequence working its way through Omori's decay curve. If a new event crosses that magnitude 7 threshold on a fresh segment, that's the signal that would genuinely change the story. Watch the ceiling and watch the location, not just the frequency. There's something almost reassuring in understanding this, isn't there? Not the false comfort of pretending a region this seismically active is somehow now safe, and not the manufactured panic of treating every aftershock as a countdown to catastrophe, well-documented physical process play out along a fault system that researchers have been studying for decades with instruments and models built specifically to make sense of exactly this kind of sequence. Southern Mindanao has been through a genuinely brutal 2 months, and the aftershocks rattling the region right now are the predictable, if unsettling, continuation of a rupture that already happened, not clear evidence of a bigger one still coming. If this made the ground beneath Mindanao feel a little more understandable and a little less like an unpredictable threat, do me a favor and hit that like button, because it genuinely helps this kind of careful, no-hype science reach more people. Subscribe so you're here when the next update drops, because with this sequence still active, this story is far from over. And tell me down in the comments, do you want me to keep tracking this sequence as it develops? I read every single one, and your questions often shape the next video. I'll see you in the next one.